And now for today's program. Rabbi Shai Held is president, dean, and chair in Jewish thought at the Hadar Institute. He received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education, has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. He is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, as well as The Heart of Torah. His latest book is Judaism Is About Love, Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish and Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Rabbi Shai Held and Amy E. Schwartz.
Thanks very much. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. Welcome, Rabbi Held, Shai.
Thank you.
I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about this extremely interesting book.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me.
Let's start with a softball. So you, as Suzanne said, you're a noted public voice on a lot of different Jewish topics. You've written a couple of books, including one about the whole, all the Heart of Torah is a week by week companion with notes on every parsha. And you run a major institute of Jewish life, the Hadar Institute. Why did you decide to write a book about love?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, in a lot of ways, I've been writing this book for 25 years. I begin my book by sharing an experience that I had that was really formative for me. I was speaking to a group of fifth-year rabbinical students at one of America's major rabbinical seminaries, and I said in passing, Judaism tells the story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. And one of the rabbinical students said, somewhat sneeringly, that just sounds a lot like Christianity to me. And I was really very taken aback. And I said to him, it's so interesting that you say that, because I was actually thinking about the morning and evening Jewish liturgy, in which we say, Ahava rabbah ahavtanu, with vast love have you loved us. And then we recite Deuteronomy, and you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your being and all your might. So that's a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. Now, the fact that your first thought is that sounds Christian to me makes me feel like we really have to have a discussion about how deeply Jews have internalized traditional Christian anti-Judaism, such that even a rabbinical student can not hear what is most fundamental to the Jewish tradition as anything other than foreign. So, that was like a really powerful experience for me. And it's been different versions of it I've had many more experiences like that. And then I don't share this story, but it's kind of a parallel that a few months later, after that experience, I was teaching a group of Protestant high school students. And I said in passing in a discussion, so remind me, what does Jesus say is the great commandment? And all 20 hands of the kids in the class go up. I call on one, and he very proudly tells me about love of God and love of neighbor. And then I innocently follow up with, and remind me, what is Jesus quoting? Not a single hand goes up, not one. And it was a moment of revelation for me, of sort of coming to understand, well, of course you can tell a story whereby Judaism is a loveless religion. You have no idea what wells Jesus was drinking from.
What's the answer to
And
the question? What was he quoting from?
so love of neighbor is Leviticus, love of
Yeah,
God is Deuteronomy, right? That's
right.
what he's
Yeah.
quoting from.
Just
Thank
wanted
you.
to underline it. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah.
So, so the primary audience for this book is Jews of every conceivable denominational stripe. Um, it's an act of reclamation and recovery, hoping to sort of recenter love, which I think has always been there all along. And it is also secondarily a book for Christians, because there are many, many, many Christians, I've met many of them, who know that they need a different way of thinking and talking about Judaism, but they don't really know how. And I hope that in some small way I can contribute to kind of giving them a different narrative of what Judaism is.
That's very interesting. And have you talked mostly to Jews so far about this book, or have you been able to talk to Christians as well?
Well, I would say I've talked mostly to Jews, but I have been recording a whole array of Christian podcasts, which has been a really interesting experience, talking to Christian theologians, talking to Christian journalists. And of course, like any conversation, it's totally shaped by the person who's interviewing you. But there is a tremendous hunger for this conversation, at least among the people who are interviewing me. Obviously, there's many people who would have no interest, but there's been a lot of that. And tomorrow night, I'm actually speaking at Boston College in a Catholic setting, a dialogue about Jewish and Catholic approaches to love. So things like that, I'm really excited about and learning a lot from.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Okay, so I want to say first that I found this book just absolutely entrancing to read. It's a lovely read. It's kind of a warm read. Every page you learn something wonderful about love and
Thank you.
about, feelings. It's really I really recommend it. And with that said, I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to push back a little bit.
By all
Um,
means.
as a total layperson before your expertise. So you say at the very outset that love is not a feeling, love is a way of being. And as the book goes on, you have various other places where you define love. Protest is an act of love, a form of love. In part three of the book, Chesed, loving kindness, you say, bringing God's love to other people. Love is acts of loving kindness. It's not about feeling love, it's about acting to take care of people. You say at a different point, treating people with respect is a way of loving them, even though there's some tension there. And you even say at a certain point that following the mitzvot, following rules, is a form of love. So it seems as if, on the one hand, you're saying people don't realize Judaism is about love, and then on the other hand, you're redefining love. So it means pretty much all the things people generally associate with Judaism. So is there a straw man there at all, or is this just a way of showing how different the Jewish and the Christian concepts of love really are?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So let me back up for a minute and say love as I'm using it um, is not equivalent to an emotion, but it certainly has emotional aspects to it. The term that I coined, that I know sounds absurdly pretentious, but that is really helpful to me in my own thinking, is that love is an existential posture. Love is a way of holding ourselves in the world, of comporting ourselves. Um, and if you prefer, you can say love is a disposition to feel in certain ways and act in certain ways. And that's important because love um, is if you define love as an emotion, nobody can be loving all the time. No one has any emotion all the time, right? Emotions come and go. You can meditate for 15 seconds and you'll see how true that is, right? Emotions come and they ebb and they flow. So love is a disposition to feel and act in certain ways that has to manifest in emotions at some moments, but is not synonymous with the emotion. I think that that's actually really quite important. Now, some of the things that you're asking about, I would distinguish between whether they are love or whether they are some of the ways that Jews express love.
Mm,
So I actually try to say that keeping the mitzvot is not love. Keeping the mitzvot is an expression of love. Keeping the mitzvot is something that we do that ideally, at least, stems from a place of love. Now, I have to say that in some ways I find it moving that you say, well, wait a minute, you're talking about love, but then you talk about all this core Jewish stuff, because in some ways, for me, that just confirms the point that all this core Jewish stuff is actually about love, right?
okay.
That
Mm,
right that love is a kind of red thread that unites an awful lot of Jewish life, but we've been very inhibited about talking about it.
mhm. So is it completely different from the way Christians mean the word love when they use it? I mean, I know there are the God is a verb people.
Well,
Um,
yes and no. Meaning, first of all, like any tradition, Christianity has a lot of different things it means by love. And I'll tell you from my conversations with some Christian theologian friends is that they feel they have the opposite problem that I feel I have. They feel like love is a word that is overused in their communities so that people can't hear it anymore, whereas I feel it's a word that's underused and people don't hear it enough. I think that that's just an interesting cultural difference. um, I think there are some ways in which Jews tend to think about love differently from Christians. For we could talk about this. For example, the Jewish attitude towards loving enemies is more complicated than
Mhm.
many Jews have been taught to think, but it is not the same as Christianity. I mean, maybe should I say a sentence about that? Is that,
Sure, I would. I did have a question on that. I want to get to it at the end. We
oh,
can move.
okay. So,
Don't,
I'll
but
hold off.
totally. But so but so actually, why don't you go there because
Yeah.
it bridges to something else I was curious about. So.
Well, so, I think that it is common to hear some kind of dichotomization. Something like Christianity teaches us to love our enemies, but Judaism says something else, like defend yourself, which is
Hmm.
a really problematic formulation because, according to many Christians, loving your enemies does not exclude defending yourself. But
Hmm.
so, first of all, I want to say that one of the things I learned in working on this book over the years is that Christians agree, for the most part, that loving your enemies is at the heart of Jesus' teaching, but they disagree fiercely about just what Jesus means by that. So, for example, does loving your enemy imply pacifism? Or does it actually require sometimes taking up arms to defend the vulnerable, from those who seek to do evil to them? Meaning, it's a complicated term even in Christianity. Now, in Jewish sources, I sort of suggest that there are a whole bunch of ways in which we are essentially obligated to love our enemies. I mean, let's just take a very simple, kind of non controversial example: the ethos of non retaliation, right? When someone hurts you, don't hurt them back, is built into the Amida prayer, the daily prayer that we say. In the end of the prayer, we say, "V'lemekalelai nafshi tidom," and to those who curse me, may my heart be silent.
I've always disliked that passage.
Well, okay, but the point is that it's there, and the rabbis actually valorize, in their language, those who are insulted but refuse to insult back,
Right.
right? And there are all kinds of rabbinic midrashim about the importance of reconciling with
Uh-huh.
people.
Right.
Where I think it gets messy is, I think that for the most part, Jewish and Christian thinkers do not, in a way that I find kind of hard, they don't often distinguish what do we mean when we say enemy. Am I talking about a guy at work I don't get along with? Am I talking about a cousin I had a business with and we had a falling out because I felt cheated? Or are we talking about a genocidal anti Semite? Like, it might not be the same answer in
Mm.
all of those cases, right? And I think Jewish sources are much more suspicious than Christian ones of loving that final category.
Well, you
And
mentioned in. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, and part of that might be that although the origins were not at a time when Christians had power, for an awful lot of Christian and Jewish history, Christians were talking about loving enemies from a position of power. Jews were wrestling with this question from a position of powerlessness. That's a very kind of formative difference, obviously.
Right, so that makes, in fact, I'm going to say something slightly mischievous, which may affect my thinking on this, which is years ago I was arguing with a Catholic friend, or not a friend, but somebody about, whether if things were different if you were part of a minority religion and why you needed separation of church and state and things like that. And he said to me, um, one could argue that the reason Christians don't burn Jews anymore is because we don't love you enough anymore. And I mean, this person I think would know better than to say that now. He was very young, but it's really stuck with me. In other words, that's a kind of love. You're saving you from hell, basically. That's a very different
Well,
kind of love.
so that is very interesting because that is another way in which, at least I argue, that Jewish tendencies about thinking about love are very different from Christian ones. So, and this is also an interesting case of Jews being a minority culture and often internalizing the value system of the majority. So many Jews are raised to think universalism is good, particularism is bad. I actually want to suggest that in the history of the West, universalism has been enormously dangerous. Universalism has been the opposite of pluralism. Universalism has marched hand in hand with imperialism, right?
Mm.
And so you have this really complicated dichotomy between Judaism and Christianity, where Jews kind of insist on the particular and moving from there to the universal. Christianity is more ambivalent about this. It really depends who you ask. I mean, my formulation of this that I is helpful for me is that Jews have always excelled at leaving other people alone because we never felt that others had to become Jewish. But the risk we've run is forgetting that other people matter.
Mm.
Whereas Christians have always excelled at remembering that other people matter, but it has taken them 2,000 years to even consider leaving anyone alone because their love was so imperialistic. And the notion that you can be a universalist in a pluralistic way is a very modern, you might even argue postmodern phenomenon. I think a very salutary one, but it's new.
Hmm. Interesting. So we're getting a little bit. I mean, this gets very philosophical, but I want to go back to I have one more sort of practical question. Actually, I have a couple, but I have a practical question about. I mean, one of the things about some of these versions of love that you offer are, sound pretty challenging. They're hard. They're hard to do. For instance, we're commanded to love, as you say, we're commanded to love the stranger as our neighbor, and then elsewhere we're commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves. So that's a pretty tall order. And
Right.
there's this theological sort of chestnut, this discussion about how can you be commanded in the Shema to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and so forth. I mean, what kind of love is that if you're just doing it because you're told to do it? So I mean, are we setting up an impossible challenge here?
Right. Well, so, you know, I sort of regret that. I don't think I said this in the book, but it seems to me that to Jewish writers, the difference between something being impossible and something being merely extremely difficult is very important. Because you
Mm,
can argue that the spiritual life takes place in the space between the very difficult and the impossible. Um,
mhm.
so I think loving, to use an interpretation of loving your neighbor that Nachmanides, Ramban offers, wanting other people to have everything that you do to the same extent that you do. That's really, really hard for all kinds of reasons we could get into. But I don't think it's impossible. And it's certainly not impossible to achieve it at moments. And so I would actually argue that that it's meant to be hard. But Jewish ethics, maybe this is helpful for some of our viewers. Jewish ethics is very different in its thrust, I think, from say Lutheran ethics. For Luther, right, the law is there in part to show me how much I'm not capable of. I break myself upon the law and I realize I can't do it.
So you need this leap of faith.
And I need to be saved by someone
Right,
else.
right.
Whereas in Jewish ethics, I think a lot of these commands are meant to open us to the possibility that we're capable of more than we think we are, which I think is actually quite a moving. I mean, I don't know if it's empirically such a convincing argument, but it's a moving one to wrestle with. Now, as for the notion of commanded love, I mean, that's obviously a really important question. One thing I would say about it that I think is helpful is I get asked a lot, can love actually be commanded? And if it is it love at all? So the question of can love be commanded? So, one of the things I find interesting is you can't turn emotions on and off like a tap, but you can cultivate them. And that's a big piece of what the spiritual life is like. Here is a point where Maimonides reading Aristotle kind of takes this on in full and makes it part of the Jewish tradition that I can't, if I see Amy hurting, I can't necessarily decide in that moment to respond compassionately, but I can have made many decisions leading up to that moment that make it more or less likely that I will respond compassionately. And that's really, really important work. Um, Now, Judaism, I think Jewish ethics does also think that sometimes commanded love is a deeper form of love. I mean, am I obligated to love my children or do I love them spontaneously? Well, I think the answer to that is yeah. It's
Little
both,
of,
right? It's not really a dichotomy. So
right.
I think Jewish sources are comfortable with the idea. Do I love God because I have to, or do I love God because I'm moved from the inside to love God? Ideally, both.
And that brings up this question of following commandments and doing things for God, right? Um,
Yeah, following commandments. Although one of the things that is important for me to emphasize is that I think Judaism has always operated on this kind of two-level system, traditionally at least, like what bracketing the modern denominations and their varying approaches to some of this. There is there is the level of law, which is kind of a theoretically listable, right? um, set of requirements. And then there is that which goes beyond the law, like living a life animated by love, a life of compassion, doing more for people than the law requires of me, right? Um, and then Jewish thinkers will debate whether that itself is part of law or not, but we can bracket that. But I think it's important to say, love is never reducible to a checklist, right? And
Mhm.
and and that's why love of God is never just keeping the mitzvot. I mean, will always be moments that codes of law don't speak to, and I need an ethos for those moments to how I respond.
Mhm. So it's funny when some of the language in the book about cultivating love made me think of sort of arranged marriages. The idea that if you put yourself in a position to love, then perhaps it arises, from service and communion, all these things.
Well,
Um,
there's a thinker that I have found really helpful about this. Reb Eliyahu Lopian, who was a prominent Musar figure, a leader in kind of Jewish ethical renewal in the 20th century, known as Reb Elia. He says something that I found really helpful. It was a kind of an intuition that I had that was inchoate. And then I read him saying this over and over again, and it really helped me. He says, people sometimes think that if you just do stuff, it will eventually elicit the right motivation. In traditional Jewish language, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. From doing it from the wrong reason, you'll come to do it for the right reason. And he says, no, the only way that can work is if you genuinely set your heart to the hope that it will do that work. There's nothing automatic about it. And then I found it really interesting that modern scholars of Aristotle debate exactly this point. Is Aristotle saying that just doing good things will instill virtue, or doing good things in the hope that my heart will open through doing them is what instills virtue? And I think, I'm not an expert in Aristotle's ethics to be sure, but I think most Aristotle scholars think what Rebellia thinks, which is no, like you have to set your heart. Otherwise, you get into the habit of doing things kicking and screaming, right? You
mm.
have to set your heart with the hope that, among other things, this opens me up.
So you're training for it,
Training
and
is a great word here. I think that's
yeah.
exactly right. I mean, Maimonides uses the word hergel, which is the Hebrew rendering of the Aristotelian term habituation.
Ah,
Training is a more congenial word than habituation for us, I think. But
mhm.
yes, it's the same idea.
Well, that's interesting. I just parenthetically, this is actually a question from Suzanne. I mean, you know, when I'm not going to ask you to define love because the whole conversation is about that. But one thing you're definitely not talking about is romantic love, right? That sort of sense of falling.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not primarily talking about romantic love, though I would say any romantic love that endures eventually becomes more like love as an orientation, right?
Mm.
Meaning, it's interesting. So this is something that I learned being at my first job out of rabbinical school. As I was a Hillel rabbi for 3 years, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that I spent many hours talking to young men who would come to me and say, I really think I might need to break up with my girlfriend. I mean, I just don't, like, my heart doesn't go crazy when I see her anymore.
Mm.
And sometimes when I was feeling a little bit, cutting, I would say, this is a great day for you because now you can actually have a relationship, right? Where you're not just swept away, you can actually learn to love her, right? You
Mm.
have to decide whether you're kind of able to do that, and but the possibility now opens before you to have a real relationship. So I do think that love in a marriage is also not based on a perpetual emotion of love. I think it's based on a posture of love that again manifests in emotion, or else it will dissipate and the commitment can't last. But it itself is not an emotion. You know, if you say to me at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, what are the three things you're feeling most right now? It might be that love for my wife is none of those things, right? It might be grumpiness, frustration, and, worrying about my neighbor who has cancer. But then if you say to me, do you still love your wife? I would say, of course, it's the most important commitment I have in the world. So
Mm.
I think we have to kind of develop nuanced language, and I'm not sure that movies and rock songs help us think in sophisticated ways about what it means to be in a loving relationship. They're
Mm.
all about the early stages,
Uh-huh. Right.
I
Well, and
think.
yeah. Well, and I guess to bring it around full circle, part of a religion focusing on love is a way to sort of refocus your sense of that away from the cultural emphasis on early stages, right? If you're practicing if you're practicing a religion that's all about love, you're going to encounter these other uh,
For sure. And ideally, that religious tradition is teaching and reteaching us generosity of spirit, kindness, the desire for others to thrive. It is a counterculture to the culture of competition, to the culture of comparison between me and other people. It's religion at its best is in that sense deeply countercultural.
mm, interesting. So let me switch back to the other side of this. We talked a little bit about mitzvot and following rules. And when you first bring this up again, sort of in the straw man version, you say, "Oh, people think Judaism is all about empty rituals," and obviously you don't think this. Even aside from the book, you're running Hadar, which is, if I understand it correctly, is all about kind of a revitalized, relevant, halachic Judaism. Um, but if it's not too intrusive, let me ask you, can you talk about first of all, what is the role of Jewish law of halacha in love? And if it's not too intrusive, would you talk about sort of your own experience of this? What's your own practice and how did you come to it?
Mm,
A big
that's a
question.
series of big questions.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, what's the relationship between law and love? So, it's funny. My editor told me at a certain point, he said, I just want you to know for every 50 pages longer that the book gets, the percentage of people who will read it goes down. There's an inverse proportion there. And so there are about 3 chapters that I wrote that didn't make it into the book. And there are 3 chapters more that I had in mind to write that I kind of had some scraps written, but then jettisoned. One of those chapters was about the relationship between love and law, which I think is an incredibly rich discussion to have with Jewish sources, to think with Jewish sources about this. So I think that I'd be inclined to say 2 things, just to kind of like, I think, a suggestive of more things that one could think about here. One is that I think in the interpersonal realm, law is a kind of backup mechanism, meaning ideally, if Amy, you are hurting, I respond to you because I care about you and I'm the kind of person who's learned to care. But if you need me and I am not yet that kind of person, or I'm just going through a really difficult time in which I'm totally focused on my child or whatever it might be, law says, you still have to concretely show up for her,
Hmm.
right? So law provides a kind of backup motivation in a way that I think is potentially quite helpful. Um, and then secondly, I think the discussion of interpreting the law in the most loving way possible is really very important. You have certain halachic decision makers, for example, who take the verse, which many of us are familiar with from synagogue, Dracheha darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom, its ways are the ways of pleasantness and all its paths are peace, as a kind of orientation to how Jewish law should be decided. Is it decided in the way that is most humane, within what the system will permit? And I think that that's actually, really important and fundamental. Now, I think if I were to speak personally, um, halakha is something that I do. It is not the place intellectually where I live. In contrast to some of my colleagues at Hadar who are really halachic thinkers, that's not really where I live, right? I live in the world of biblical studies, philosophy, theology, um, and honestly, there are ways in which halakha can be challenging for me because I'm not a person who's oriented to details, which is actually to my detriment in a lot of ways, right? I'm not good at that. And so while I'm committed to doing things, it's not where my head is all the time. I hope that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, I do think a lot about the role of interpersonal halakha in my life. In other words, given that I am not yet a particularly virtuous person and I am not always animated by compassion, like I am animated sometimes by other things, frustration, sometimes competitiveness, whatever it might be, I'm sort of really interested in the idea that says, like, no, you're actually obligated to go to that Shiva. You're actually obligated to ask that person who's in the hospital if there's something you can do to help her. Like as a deeply imperfect Jew, I find the halachic nature of this actually quite interesting. I also should say, I guess, that I do think that in our culture, the laws of Shabbat are very helpful to me because I could not stop without them. And that is, I don't know if that's a statement about them or a statement about me, but I'm so, wait, I should go upstairs to my office and write more. Or and there's a way in which Shabbat's like says, no, actually you can't. You may not. And I actually find that in an interesting way. This is a very traditional thing to say. I find that prohibition quite liberating,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's a very Jewish formulation, right? That the fact that I'm not allowed to is freeing.
Hmm. So, but you experience all that. So your observance, your decisions you make about that, you don't see as necessarily part of this framework about love. This is sort of a different track.
Well, no, I mean, I do. Wait, you mean about Shabbat?
Well, you could use Shabbat. I'm just
Well,
pressing it.
I so for me, the stopping is very much tied with an acknowledgement of God as creator, a recognition of gratitude for the fact that I'm not the creator of my own life. So the halachot actually create opportunities for me to be cognizant of love.
Hmm.
That's that's how they ideally work. I'm not trying to romanticize the Jewish tradition. I don't. That's not what I want to do. There are times when honestly there are some Shabbatot when it's just like why can't I do what I want to do right now?
Hmm.
Right? But but I there are ways. Here I'll speak very personally for a minute, and I worry that I'm like a bizarre outlier on this. I find making kiddush on Friday night an extremely, extremely moving ritual. Not always, but much of the time. It is the moment in the week when I declare, I am not the author of my own life. I did not make this gloriously beautiful world I live in. It's all yours, God. I find it really moving. Um,
I think that's kind of
again,
spectacular, actually.
what do you say?
I said I think that's kind of spectacular, actually. That's a
And
very yeah.
it's certainly not always true. Some
Yeah.
days I'm busy wondering why my kids won't sit still for 2 minutes, or but there that ritual is a moment of real kavanah for me, of real intentionality, in a way that very few things consistently are.
Hmm. Hmm. That's very interesting. So let's go back to this question of whether what happens if love and caring inform everything we do.
Hmm.
Um, I wasn't going to ask this, but I think it looks like we will have time. Do you think that if that's intrinsic to Judaism, do you think that has anything to do with the well-known tendency till at least till recently of for Jews to be politically liberal? I mean,
That's an interesting question. I think that the Jewish preoccupation with caring for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, these three paradigmatic, vulnerable people, is deeply kind of etched in Jewish consciousness. And so it makes sense that Jews have often felt, even as they've become secularized, sometimes even especially as they've become secularized, what they've held on to is that sensibility, that sensitivity to the plight of the weak and the vulnerable. Um, I think it makes sense that Jews have identified with movements that have seen the plight and the welfare of those people as central to them. Now, you know, I think there are different ways of reading the tradition, meaning you can't derive, this is something that's actually important to me to say, you can't derive contemporary policy from reading biblical texts, right? So someone might say, and they might say it in good faith, you know, I am deeply concerned with the plight of the poor, but I don't share, I don't know, the Democratic Party's vision for how to do that. And I think that's totally legitimate as long as it's done in good faith, right? Um, but I do think you're probably onto something really important, um, which is a Jewish tradition has insistently said over and over and over again, you know, usually in the mouth of God, if you don't care about the downtrodden, you are not in the conversation that I created you for, right? Right? Caring for the downtrodden is everything.
Hmm.
On some level, everything might be hyperbolic, but it is certainly really fundamental. I mean, every Yom Kippur, we come to shul and have this incredible moment where we hear the prophet Isaiah say to us, the fact that you are here and are not, unfettering the bonds that hold people in captivity is a disgrace and an abomination. I mean, imagine if we took that haftarah seriously, right? I mean, imagine really taking that to heart.
Huh. Right. Well, that's that too. That goes back to, I think, actually someone in the questions raises the observation that when you refer to mitzvot as rules, you're missing a dimension, that it's not really about following rules. It's about the spirit that's behind those rules and the duty that
Yeah,
is
I,
in
I have been feeling lately that a better term, I mean, I think it's really a translation of Torah rather than halacha, but the better term is instruction,
that. Mm,
or guidance. I think law is just like a limiting word for halacha. I mean, you might translate halacha as path, but
huh.
anyway, I mean, I
Right.
do think that there are aspects of it that are law, but it's more than that. I
Hmm.
mean, because if I say to you that Maimonides says that the cultivation of compassion is a legal requirement, so that's not the way most people think about what law is. It's more expansive than that.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, you talk, to go back to sort of this question of the stranger, and compassion, and who's you who are you thinking about? You spend quite a while in the book talking about the sort of the rabbinical discussions of, like, okay, well, you're supposed to love your neighbor. Who's your neighbor? You're supposed to love the stranger. Who's the stranger? Does that mean, what does that mean? I mean, it becomes a political argument at some point. But do you want to
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that one of the
recount?
reasons why talking about who the neighbor is and who the stranger is so important is that we always want to avoid big principles kind of devolving into platitudes, right? Love the neighbor. Okay, what does that mean? Nothing in particular, which is why I spend so much time thinking about how different Jewish interpreters have understood what that mandate requires of us. I mean, I always say the mitzvah of loving your neighbor is so wonderfully quintessentially Jewish, right? That is, everyone agrees it's one of the great principles of the Torah. No one can agree about what it means, right? And I think there's something so wonderful about that. It's everything. What does it mean? Let's have an argument, right? So I think there's just something so wonderful about that. Um, but so I think actually, like, diving deep into what does this require of us is really, really important. And one of the ways I tried to structure that chapter, about loving your neighbor, is let's talk about love, let's talk about and let's talk about neighbor, right? Or better, let's talk about love, let's talk about neighbor, and let's talk about what yourself is, right? Because I think, there's so much to talk about there. Now, about who falls into these categories, that was important to me to spend time on because I wanted to emphasize that I think Judaism resists the simple dichotomy between the particular and the universal, and actually is really committed to a particularist path towards the universal, and that is not necessarily the way that we talk in our culture, certainly not the way a lot of young adults talk in our culture. And I thought it was a useful thing to talk about how love your neighbor, on the one hand, at least biblically, clearly means love your fellow Jew. But there's also the mandate of loving all humanity. And those two things are not in contradiction with each other, right? One is, in some sense, a path to the other, or at least ideally ought to be. I mean, there is always the danger. I never seem to tire of saying family first always runs the risk of devolving into family only. But family first is never meant to be family first and family only. Family first is meant to be and everyone else second, and that matters, right?
Hmm.
There's a wonderful medieval text, Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, great Talmudic commentator. He says, commenting on the passage of the Talmud that says, oh, the poor of your city come before the poor of another city. And he says, please note that that formulation means that the poor of another city are also people towards whom you have obligation. First does not mean only. And that's actually what helped me with the family first, family only piece, is that I felt like, oh, here's a classical Jewish source that is really groping to say the same thing.
And you say in the book at one point that the idea that the particular is a path to the universal, in other words, that loving, taking care of your family leads you to caring about the wider world, is it might be the reverse of Christian universalism, where you start by loving in a universal way, and that's supposed to lead you to love the individual or the person closest to you.
Yeah, although I have to say that it's interesting. Just yesterday, a very prominent Catholic ethicist said to me, you know, the way you portray Christianity in that chapter is really a portrayal of Martin Luther. It is not a portrayal of how Catholics tend to think about ethics. Aquinas is on your team.
Hmm,
And I
interesting.
thought that was really interesting. And I need to sort of process. One of the reasons I'm looking forward to tomorrow's conversation in a Catholic setting is that I really welcome those challenges. I do think it's true, though, that whereas some Christian thinkers will say love your neighbor means love everyone in the world equally, you don't find Jewish sources saying that. Jewish sources are not embarrassed by what philosophers call partiality. That is the idea that I'm partial to certain people. Of course, I love my children more than I love your children. Even if I love your children, that's true.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. So let's go back for a second to this question. We were talking briefly about the power differential, whether it's easier to love your enemies if you have power than if you are powerless. And
Mhm.
I wanna jump sideways on that. Um, okay. Sorry, let me hit. Um, you address this in passing, don't get me wrong, but one thing that did strike me was that for a book that talks so much about love, the discussion has very little to say about the possible differing dynamic of this for men versus women. There's very little about how this might become gendered. And you say, well, the demand for loving selflessness might play worse for people who are expected to give up everything and just love others selflessly. And you quote Charlotte Bronte very nicely. But on the other hand, there's this side reference. For instance, you mentioned the whole Abraham and Lot thing. They're in such precarious situation as strangers. And oh, by the way, Lot offers his daughters to be raped by the mob, and Abraham basically pimps Sarah out to Pharaoh. And you go on, you say, well, those are ethically, you call these ethically ambiguous, but there isn't that sense of that they would be, completely against any like love based uh,
Yeah. So it feels to me like you're asking two different questions. You can correct me if I'm wrong. One is it is important to me in this book that I talk um, a bunch about care ethics and other forms of feminist ethics, precisely because I think it's really important that we not sort of just assign compassion to women. And similarly, um, in the chapter on family, that we talk about how nurture is an obligation for men and not just women. That's very, very important to me. Very important to me in my life, and very important to me as a teacher. So I like to think that I do try to sort of go there and underscore that point. And in fact, in ways that I'm still trying to unpack, feminist ethics have been extremely important for me in all kinds of ways. Um, for the second question, look, I think that um, there are many texts that are starkly patriarchal. Um, and one of our options is to criticize them for that, which I'm not opposed to. But another is to sort of kind of bump up against the text and see what else we might find in those texts. So, for example, I spend a lot of time on the story of Hagar, which I think is just so important because Hagar is the paradigm of the person who's unseen, who God sees nevertheless. And that's a really important thing for me theologically, because I really believe that the God of the Bible is the God who sees those whom we ignore. And that is Hagar, right? I mean, the example that I just love, I think this is just so powerful, is that Abraham and Sarai refer to Hagar never by name. That servant, your servant. And then the angel shows up, and the first word he says to Hagar is Hagar. It's an unbelievable moment. And then she says, Ata el roi, you are the God who sees me.
Oh
I mean,
wow.
that is just arresting beyond words to me. And I think there are other texts too where sometimes I don't mean this as apologetics, because there are biblical texts that are very disturbing. But I give you an example of a text that is sometimes mentioned in in ways that are used to condemn the Bible that I think are a misreading. So the last few chapters of the book of Judges are this horrific story of the almost unimaginably brutal rape of a concubine, right? And I've heard people say, oh, this is like such a misogynistic conclusion to the book of Judges. But I actually think that the very opposite is the case. The book of Judges is saying, which is the book of Judges, which is about the devolution of Israelite society. The culmination of the devolution of Israelite society is physical abuse towards women, right? Judges is asking us to be revolted by that story, right? It is actually a kind of proto-feminist story in my mind.
Hmm.
So I just think we have to be kind of deliberate about what we're talking about. Now, I do think there are passages in the Bible that are very disturbing. I will say some of the passages in the Bible that I find hardest to live with are passages in which God is made to sound like an abusive husband. I wish you didn't force me to beat you.
Right, right.
I find those passages very hard to make peace with. I've listened to too many women talk about the relationships they've been in. Those are very, very hard for me.
Hmm.
And I can say, nice things about God's pathos and that it stems from God loving us. But you know what? Sometimes abusive men talk that way too.
Right.
Like I only hit you because I love you so, right? It makes me very queasy. I will just say, and it's very important to me in teaching those texts to name that, because I don't want to be engaged in kind of making sacred the kind of language that gets people wounded and even killed. It's very, very important to me.
Yeah, no, I, I, I didn't mean to. Just to be clear, I wasn't trying to hang all the patriarchal texts in the Bible around your neck on this. I just thought it made for an
No,
interesting
no.
juxtaposition to the, to
Yeah.
this caring ethic. You're right. I mean, the feminist caring ethic is very much to the fore in dealing with some of these texts. So I just have one more question, and then it sounds like Suzanne's got quite a few in the queue, and I'm delighted. It seems like it's a good audience. Um, but one of your chapters, and I thought of it because you mentioned Hagar. One of your chapters is called "Love in the Ruins," and you talk about the ethic of love in a time or a place of devastation. And I
Mm.
wondered if you wanted to address that just briefly before we wrap up.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I mean, maybe I'll start by talking personally for a moment, because I came to realize that people in my own life were teaching me what I had written about in that chapter, but not internalized enough. Let me just clarify what I mean by that. So, the galleys of this book arrived at our home on October 14th. And I said to my wife, I don't care about this book one bit. And it was such a painful thing to say. It was, 6.5 years of my life. And it took me a few days to even open the box. I didn't want, it was just like, all I feel right now is grief and anger and loneliness. And I, I don't want any part of this. And then I started sharing with some friends and some students that I was feeling like my book could not be coming out at a worse moment. And to a head, people kept saying to me, I think you have this backwards. I want to talk about love now more than I ever have before. And I honestly found it very hard. And I'll be honest and say, I still find it hard. There's a part of me that is still, all I want to do is grieve. Um, but I realized that they were actually saying something to me that I think is deeply rooted in the tradition, which is that when the world falls apart, one of our mandates is to love more. It is not our only mandate, to be sure, but it is one of them. And the sort of like the liturgical example of that I give, because I just think it's so striking and kind of amazing, is that Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is the day when we mourn every horrible thing that has happened to the Jewish people in our history. And then the Shiva is not yet over, and we get to the 15th of Av, Tu B'Av, which is, according to the Mishnah, one of the two happiest days of the year, when women would go out into the fields and meet men, and they would couple off. And I'm like reading these Mishnayot in the 4th chapter of Masechet Tanya. I'm like, oh, what on earth, right? Tisha B'Av is the saddest day of the year, and the happiest day of the year is less than a week later. But it made me sort of understand that part of how we respond to devastation is through love, right?
Mm.
That, Shiva's not even over, and already we're like, no, let's bring more love into the world. That's really very powerful. Now, again, I'm not saying love is the only response. I don't want to sound Pollyannish. I mean, some of what you do in the face of destruction is rebuild. And, some of what you do in the face of destruction is defend yourself so that you don't get destroyed again. I mean, there's a lot of things you have to do. But the notion that the Jewish tradition builds in love as a response to devastation kind of takes my breath away.
Mm. All right. Well, that's a great note to end this part on. Anyway, thank you for all this wisdom, for this teaching, and it's
Thank you.
really a pleasure to talk to you. And let me turn it over to Suzanne and the questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful conversation. There are quite a few. Let's see if we can get to a few of these. Oh, I do want to clarify that the initial question about romantic love, that was from one of our audience members. I did want to make sure that we pointed that out. I'm wondering if Rabbi Held could say something about the following sentence that's in your book. God's love is not something we earn, but rather something we ought to strive to live up to. This is a good definition of Judaism's version of the spiritual life, the attempt to live up to God's love. What does it look like to live up to God's love?
Great. Thank you for that. Well, first of all, what do I mean by that? You know, I'm playing with the idea that maybe if we don't feel that we have to compete, we don't purchase the illusion of self-worth by imagining that we're better than other people. Maybe if we believe that we are always already loved and valuable, we can actually live in a more generous, open-hearted way, because we don't need to scrape, and be attacking other people or wishing ill for them. So I think that, for example, when Rabbi Akiva says that the human being is beloved just by dint of being created in God's image, what he's saying is that we're always already loved by God. And so the spiritual life is not about earning God's love. God already loves us. Rather, the spiritual life is about living up to God's love, meaning I think Judaism makes this totally wild claim that God believes in us as agents. Now, empirically, you might say God believes in us as in agents. Doesn't God read the New York Times? Right? I mean, right? I mean, it's hard, right? But I think that's kind of the Jewish argument, is that God believes in us as agents. We are capable of building a more just, more loving, more compassionate world, a world in which human dignity is real, a world in which God's presence is actually something that we can actually sense. What it means to live up to God's love, I'm suggesting, is to live our lives in such a way that furthers those goals, that makes those goals seem less like, Pollyannish dreams and more like something that's real.
Thank you. Do you think that Jews not associating Judaism as a religion of love is similar to many Jews' aversion to talking about God? And most Jews don't talk about God the way Christians do. An example being when you're watching an award show, many times the first thing someone says will be, I want to thank God. And that's not something that secular Jews are used to doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Is the Jewish hesitation um, talking about love connected to, bound up with the Jewish hesitation of talking about God? The real answer to that is I really want to think about that more. That question brings me up short a little bit. I certainly think that Jews are very afraid of talking about a God of love, and that in combining those 2 points. And part of that, it seems to me, is also about having internalized an anti-Jewish trope that we're all familiar with, which is, the God of the quote unquote Old Testament is a God of vengeance and anger, whereas the God of the New Testament is a God of love. I think that's like a tragic um, internalization. First of all, as I argue at length in this book, I think the God of the Hebrew Bible is, fundamentally a God of love. And also, as a friend of mine who's a Christian Bible scholar likes to say, for those Christians who feel like the Old Testament is violent, I invite you to read the book of Revelation and then call me back, right? It's far more violent than anything in the Hebrew Bible, meaning to the extent that you think, which is a discussion for another day, to the extent that you think divine anger and divine violence are a problem, they're a problem in both testaments. Um, but I find the question really interesting. I want to think about it more. Whoever asked that question, feel free to email me so that it stays on my agenda. It's a really interesting. Thank you for that.
If the Song of Songs is really about the love between God and the Jewish people, why does the wording come across as so erotic?
Okay, so I'm laughing because that's such a Jewish question. I love it. Well, first of all, I think that well, okay. Well, first of all, let me say most academic Bible scholars think the Song of Songs is a poem about love between two humans that Jews interpreted as love between God and Israel or love between God and the human soul. There is a minority of Bible scholars who actually argue that Song of Songs always had built into it a dimension that was spiritual. It was about God um, um, and Israel and their love for each other. I actually think that the eros is quite moving. And it actually goes to a question Amy asked me a long time ago about what about romantic love? I think the argument is that the love between God and Israel is also deeply passional, right? The God of love and between God and Israel. Now that's a hard thing to say in our disenchanted modern world. But if you read the book of Deuteronomy, right? God is like reaching in and grabbing our hearts and saying, I want to be loved right there, right? And that passional nature is really important. But I also want to note that it is really striking that in the Song of Songs, there are many missed moments where one partner is available for love and the other partner fails to show up. And I find it really poignant that Jews read this text as about the relationship between God and Israel, right? Oh, there are missed moments even in the relationship between God and Israel, right? There's this amazing scene in the Song of Songs, right, where the male lover shows up and knocks on the door, and the woman who's been waiting for him has this moment of hesitation, and she says, am I really going to get out of bed? I'm already in bed. I'm not going to get the door. And then like a minute later, she kind of rouses herself, goes to the door, and he's gone. And it's just like, I totally get why mystics are obsessed with this text. It actually makes lots of sense because God often feels like just beyond our grasp, as it were. So I think it's actually very moving that the imagery is so erotic or better, romantic.
Mhm. So before we wrap up, let's try to get to one more. How do you see this love manifest in the give and take of classical learning in the Beit Midrash?
um, it's a great question. Um, so I want to answer it in two ways. One is that I think that what you see often in a traditional Beit Midrash is immense, immense passion. And passion is closely related to love. That said, when we were building the Hadar Beit Midrash, I was sort of very emphatic. We are not going to build another Beit Midrash in which people are screaming at each other about a text, right? I don't want a Beit Midrash that sometimes feels like a locker room. First of all, I don't want it to be totally male. And second of all, I want a model that we can also have disagreements in ways that are gentle. I'm not at all condemning the traditional culture of a Beit Midrash. Again, I think it's deeply passional, and there are people for whom it's very powerful. Um, but we have tried to build a very different kind of Beit Midrash with a different tenor and a different tone. So, elu ve'elu, these and those are both, I think, appropriate ways of creating cultures of Torah conversation.
Great, thank you. And to wrap up, there is a comment I just wanted to share. Somebody wrote in, love and joy. When a difficult time is upon us, our joy must fill the air. Rabbi Nachman. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, or we'll just leave it at that.
I will let that person have the last word.
Okay. Well, thank you, Shai. Thank you, Amy, so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I want to thank the audience for joining us. Just a reminder, the book is Judaism Is About Love, Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life. I've put a link in the chat. I will be sending out a follow-up email, and I will include a link both to the Hadar Institute as well as a link to the book. And you can find this on our website tomorrow at momentmag.com. Be sure to check that out and register for next week's program. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.